Grab a Bible if you would and open it to the Old Testament book of Ruth. I want you to put your marker there if you have one of those in your Bible. Put your marker there in the book of Ruth. We're going to be there for most of our service this morning. Once you've done that, flip over to Psalm 27. That's what Chris read for us this morning. I appreciate him reading from that section. He stopped right where I wanted him to stop because I'm going to pick up from there in just a couple seconds. But Psalm 27 is where I want you to start with as we begin this morning. It's so good to be with all of you. We have another full house, a full crowd here with us this morning. It's also good to see Mike. He snuck in here. I didn't get to say hi to him beforehand. Although I do say, I speak for everyone when I say we would much rather see Tiffany and the kids. But we'll take, I don't even get an amen on my sermon, and I got an amen on that. Apparently I do speak for everybody. But it is good to have everybody here with us. It's good to see all these faces, especially in what has been a very, at least in my opinion, a very trying and a very tumultuous year. I don't know if it's just me, but it seems like 2025 has just been a really fast kick in the teeth for me. We've began this year, 2025, with what seemed to be just a host of medical problems in our extended family, and that was kind of touch and go there in January and February, and then it continued with the loss of what I would consider two very beloved women that have been attending at Hillside for decades. And so we lost both of them within about 6 weeks of each other. And then you move into the summer and there seemed to be everybody else having issues. It always seemed like I was fielding phone calls about this or that, and then tragedy after tragedy, all these different things that happened. And then just to ratchet it up even more, the last few weeks of political turmoil and trial have just made 2025, and I never thought I'd say this after 2020, it made 2025 a year that I just kind of want to get through. I'm happy with what we've accomplished, and there's been a lot of great things, and I'm not here decrying any of that, but I'm looking forward to kind of turning the page into something that seems a little bit different. And when you have years like that, when you have years like the ones that we've had, which has just been tough for a lot of people, especially people in this room, I don't really have any magic words for you. Not that I'm just a fountain of wisdom or anything up here talking about all the different things that we need to do to make the last 3 months great. I don't have that for you. The Bible does. I don't. But I do think that in a lot of situations and things like this, the best thing that we can do is just kind of try hanging on. And I used to not feel that way about a lot of stuff. I used to think, well, you need to make the best of certain situations and always try to turn it into a positive. And I still think if you can do that, that'd be great. But I think in some cases, some years, some months, sometimes in your life, the best thing that you can do is just kind of hang on. Psalm 27, we pick up right after where Chris left off. Look in verse 11, though, because that's where I want us to start with. Verse 11 of Psalm 27, he says, "Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a level path because of my foes." And that, if you remember what Chris read for us, that's the anthem. There's a lot of persecutions, a lot of opposition in his life. He says in verse 12, "Do not deliver me over to the desire of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me, and such breathe out violence." Then in verse 13, if you highlight or underline, I really want you to focus on this verse. Verse 13, "I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." Verse 14, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord." This whole psalm, and we just kind of read a little bit. Chris read from us at the beginning. We jumped to verse 11. This entire psalm is one of just kind of perseverance. And this isn't the only psalm that's like this. If you look at a lot of the psalms in this book, a lot of them are about just kind of hanging on. And it's almost as if writing these psalms for the psalmist is a form of their own personal therapy. I don't really know who to talk to about this. I don't really even know what to say half the time. And so I'm just going to get my thoughts out on paper. The fact that they rhyme in Hebrew is a bonus. But I'm just going to kind of talk. And they always end, most of them end with this kind of triumphant system at the end in verse 14, where he says, regardless of anything that happens, I'm just going to trust in God. That's going to be the thread that I'm going to hang on. And I remember hearing verse 13 a long time ago in a sermon, and it was a sermon that was predominantly based around hope. And so you went into Hebrews 6 and you talk about hope. You talk about it from John a little bit. But he anchored his sermon here in Psalm 27 verse 13. And ever since then, that verse has just always kind of stuck with me in times like this, where he says declaratively, "I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." That says a lot about people's sometimes mindsets, where you don't really have the faith that you need. You don't always are full of energy. And you don't have always this sense of optimism, this just unbridled passion that you should have. In some cases, as he says in verse 13, I would have lost faith completely if it hadn't been for the deep foundational belief that he says, I would have seen the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. And in some cases, that's enough. And you think about somebody like Job, and you read how his entire book unfolds. And the first chapter, he's hit with the sledgehammer, and the second chapter, he's hit with the truck. And he kind of has this thread throughout the entire book where he just says, look, I don't really know what I'm doing. Nothing makes sense to me anymore. And so I would have lost hope of all of it if I hadn't had this foundational belief to my core. The female counterpart to somebody like Job is somebody like Naomi. When you look in the book of Ruth, go to that ribbon that you put there earlier and go back to Ruth chapter 1. When you look at the story of Naomi and Ruth, it is exactly the same as what you have with somebody like Job. The main difference, obviously, is Job is male, Naomi is female. The other major difference is that Job gets to reason his way out. 38 chapters in the book of Job, he gets to say, well, I don't know what about this, I don't know about this, and these are all my thoughts and philosophies about these things. His friends, either to their credit or their discredit, then come back to him with various things. But it is 38 chapters of ration and logic and reason. Naomi doesn't get any of that. If you look in Ruth chapter 1, notice the first 5 verses, because they're very much on par, I think, with what you see a little bit there in Job. Ruth chapter 1, starting in verse 1. It came about in the 10 days when the judges governed, which that tells you the timeline. It's not the best era of Jewish history. When the judges governed, that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. So there's a famine. He leaves his homeland. He goes to the Moabites, which are not friendly towards Jews. Verse 2, the name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem and Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. Then Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. And they took for themselves Moabite women as wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other one was Ruth. They lived there for about 10 years. And then, verse 5, then both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman was bereft of her 2 children and her husband. So here's what you have laid out. In 5 very simple verses, the story of Ruth explodes with multiple tragedies. In verses 1 through 5, she is forced because of a famine to go to Moab, not friendly territory. But she goes there with her husband because there's a famine. So they go there hoping to secure goods for themselves. They find some daughters-in-law for their sons. Everything's happy. We're positive. Things are looking up. Then you lose your husband. Naomi's husband is gone. And without explanation, then you have these 2 sons. There's some light in the life. And then you lose those 2 sons. And so now you have Naomi sitting there with Ruth and Orpah. They have a great relationship, it seems like. But she doesn't have anybody she came there with. She's in a foreign land, and she is helpless. And if you know anything about women in this time period, in this socioeconomic situation, there is not a lot of hope for her. The best that somebody in her position can hope for is a very long and less painful death, because you don't have the ability in this society to really make means for yourselves. You are 100% dependent on the charity and the generosity of others, which you find in Ruth, but we'll pass the story. But there's no hope for her. And so as you progress forward here in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 8, she translates that exact same lack of hope towards these women. Verse 8, Naomi says to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt kindly with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the houses of her husband. And then she kissed them, they lifted up their voices and they wept. And they said to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. There's that great relationship that they have. And then in verse 11, Naomi said, return, my daughters, why should you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? No, I'm past childbearing age, she says. Verse 12, return, my daughters, for I'm too old to have a husband. If I said I have hope, let's say in some far-off universe, Naomi says, that I have hope. If I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, are you going to wait for them until they're grown? Would you refrain from them marrying? No, my daughters, for it is harder for me than for you, for the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. They lifted up their voices and wept again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So now you have this other situation where Naomi is looking at her daughters-in-law and saying, look, I'm a goner. There's no hope for me. The only hope you have, my only 2 people in my life, is for you to go find happiness. And they fight it, obviously. But eventually Orpah leaves. And verse 13, one of the most beautiful passages in this section, is that Ruth clings to her. But imagine being at that position in your life where the only lights in your life, the only hope that you have is gone. And now you're begging people not to go down with your sinking ship. That's the state that she's in. And she even says, quite frankly, there in verse 13, that the hand of the Lord has gone forth against me. And then you jump to verse 20. She says to them, do not call me Naomi, now that she's back in Bethlehem. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why then do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has witnessed against me and the Almighty has afflicted me? I would argue to you that Naomi is in exactly the same type of position that Job is in Job chapter 1 and 2. Job still has faith. Naomi still has faith. But she believes adamantly that the only explanation for her tragedies in her life is the fact that God is out to get her. And we've all felt like that at times. I think all of us have felt at various points in our lives that there's just some kind of situation where it just doesn't seem like it's getting any better, that it just seems like we're hit by hit and hit and hit. And you feel like God is out to get you. And then to keep going further, now that she's back in Bethlehem, she's forced to glean for survival, which is a trait that in Leviticus is only reserved for the poor, the orphans, and the widows. Those are the only people that can do that. Now, you can if you're hungry and you're passing by the other field, but that's not your main basis. And keep in mind that gleaning is not a long-term sustainability option. You're going out every single day hoping you find something. That's your mode of life. But then there's something that changes. Because when you look at Ruth chapter 2, in verse 20, things start looking up. And you have the introduction of Boaz and their relationship with Ruth. But things start picking up. Look in Ruth chapter 2 and verse 20. It's up there on the board. Naomi's attitude picks up a little bit because now she says in regards to God, may he be blessed of the Lord, talking about Boaz, who has not withdrawn his kindness to the living and to the dead. Now she has a different interpretation of God. There's some switches happening there. And then you move forward in Ruth chapter 4 and verse 14. And then she says, blessed is, or people say about Naomi, blessed is the Lord who has not left you without a redeemer today. The end of Ruth, by the way, has one of the most amazing endings of any book in the Bible, in my opinion, because it ends with this incredibly challenged and tragic woman bouncing a baby boy named Obed on her knee. And Obed, as she's the nurse for Obed turns into the father of Jesse. Jesse turns into the father of David. And so she ends as being essentially the step-grandmother to King David. And it's such a turnaround. And so when you think about this story, and obviously it can be super tragic when you read Ruth in its entirety, and you look at all these different things that happened to her, the easy thing to do is when you get through with chapter 1, think, well, all hope is gone. That's certainly where she was. But what did she cling to? This verse, I would argue. This exact same verse. I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Here's my question for you, if we're talking about faith. Where's the proof? Where is the evidence of that hope? Because as you look at Ruth, it seems very obvious that she maintains some shred of hope. But why? And Shell mentioned it during the sermon this morning when we talked about Job. Job's wife, in the exact same scenario, walks up to Job and says, do you still keep your integrity? And then with the ultimate challenge, he or she says to him, curse God and die. Give it up. Just give it all up. You have that feeling. I'm sure I've had that feeling. But why do you have hope in the midst of tragedy? And that, I think, is in a sense, the genesis of 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. We use 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15 almost in a neutral sense where we say, well, you should just have your hope be an example of evangelism. Have a reason for the hope that is within you. For anyone that asks you, there's a sense in which, as a blanket statement, that's exactly right. That people just walk up to you, hey, why do you believe what you believe? Well, here's why I believe that. That's not really the context. Because in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, it is in the center of a section that is dominated by persecution. And so the idea in that section is the exact same that Job talks about, the exact question we can ask with Ruth, which is, why do you still have hope? In today's economic or political climate, in your family history, maybe you're going through something that is beyond reason, somebody may ask you, why do you still have hope? There's an opportunity for evangelism. That's exactly what the psalmist said. I still have hope. I don't know why. I still have it. The question is why. And I think when you look at somebody like Naomi, the answer is very simple. The answer for the hope, the answer for the thread that's holding her together is Ruth. Ruth is a phenomenal figure. And it's ironic, I think, when you look at the narrative of Ruth as a whole, because it almost seems like she's a background character. Naomi's tragedy is front and center. Boaz is front and center. And Ruth almost seems like this faceless person that exists in the background, almost as if in this book she's an image of God herself. But notice how you see Naomi, or Ruth, kind of transitioning in this passage. In Ruth chapter 1, for instance, Ruth provides some serious emotional security. We stopped in verse 13. Or we stopped in verse 14. Listen to verse 15. And this is a passage, if you've Go to any wedding, I'm sure it's repeated. In Ruth chapter 1 and verse 15, she said, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. I mean, make the smart choice here, Naomi says to Ruth. And Ruth says, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God, your God, my God. Where you die, that's what I said, verse 17, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord do to me, and worse, if anything, but death parts you and me. Part of the reason that we talk about Ruth as being an image of God is there's no rationale for this behavior. Ruth has every reason in the world to leave Naomi and go make a life for herself. So why does she extend such limitless mercy to somebody that really provides her with nothing in return? That's part of the story of Ruth. Why does she do this? Because of grace, her mercy, and just compassion. There's that security that Naomi needs. And Naomi knows in Ruth chapter 1 and verse 15 that regardless of anything that happens else in her life, she at least has Ruth. They're going together. Wherever they go, they're going together. Notice that she provides that humble service. Ruth chapter 2, verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, listen carefully, my daughter, do not glean in another field. Furthermore, do not go from this one. This is after their interaction. Boaz has eyes for Ruth. Ruth has eyes for Boaz. There's the love story of the book. Furthermore, do not go from this one, but stay here with my maids. I want you to glean from my fields. Verse 9, let your eyes be on my field, which they reap, and go after them. Indeed, I have commanded the servants not to touch you. You're not going to be harassed out here. When you are thirsty, go to the water jars, drink from what the servants draw. Then she fell on her face and bowing to the ground said to him, why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me since I am such a foreigner? Boaz replied to her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law after the death of your husband has been fully reported to me, and how you left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and came to a people that you did not previously know. What a packed verse. Ruth's reputation in the society that she exists in is one of service. Nobody knows why she's there. She just loves Naomi. Nobody knows why she does the thing. She just loves and serves. May the Lord reward your work and your wages be full from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to seek refuge. And then she said, I have found favor in your sight, and Lord, for you have comforted me, and indeed have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. You serve me, she says in verse 13, and I'm serving you. But all of this comes because she's serving Naomi. And this service that she gives to Naomi is seen by these people as almost an act of service towards God. We all notice it. We all see it. Nobody knows why you're doing it, but we all see it. She gives her some hope too. We look in Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 14. Ruth chapter 3, starting in verse 14. It says, she lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, give me the cloak. This is Boaz talking about Ruth. Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. And then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, Naomi, she said, how did it go, my daughter? You can almost feel Naomi kind of pulling the strings in the background of this. How'd it go? And she told her all that the man Boaz had done for her. And she said, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, don't go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And she said, Naomi has the voice of wisdom and experience here. Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out. For man's not going to rest until he has settled it today. Naomi knows at this point exactly what's happening. And you as the detached reader know exactly what's happening here because Naomi sees the eyes that Boaz has for Ruth. He knows what's eventually going to take place. It involves shoes in chapter 4. That's a separate story. But she knows exactly what's going to take place. Boaz is going to marry Ruth. Ruth is going to provide a son. And at the end of this book, in Ruth chapter 4, that's where Naomi is bouncing the baby boy Obed on her knee, and everybody looks at her as being blessed and beloved. But Ruth is the conduit by which that hope presents itself. It is not an exaggeration, in my opinion, to argue that Ruth is the one single thing that holds Naomi intact during this story. Because as she said, and as we talked about earlier, why is it that you have hope? Why do you have any kind of speculation? Why do you maintain integrity? It's because of Ruth. And so let me ask you these 2 questions. Number 1, who is your Ruth? If you're being honest with yourself, I'm being honest with myself, I would argue that there was a point in your life where you were hanging on by a thread. And you would have, Psalm 27 verse 13, probably had despaired if you had not believed that you would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. But that goodness was manifested through a person, that somebody held a lifeline to you, gave you some hope, and that was your Ruth. me ask you a follow-up question. When were you a Ruth to somebody? And I would argue that we probably don't know when we were this person. We interact with people all day inside this assembly. We interact with people through the week. And we don't know when we're struggling or when other people are struggling. And we don't know what that conversation is going to be like. We don't know what they're dealing with. But it could be very well that you were a Ruth to somebody when they were hanging on by a thread and they didn't have anywhere to go, and you were the one that kept their faith intact. I would like to make a statement here as we think about this. We need to be more proactive in being Ruths to each other. We need to be more proactive in being Ruths to each other. I think sometimes we struggle with knowing how to help people because we feel like we're being presumptuous. We think to something, well, if I go and offer them help, I'm being presumptuous and I'm assuming that they have a problem. That's different than seeing a need and seeing somebody struggling and actually going to do that. That's what Hebrews 10, 24 and 25 is all about. That's part of why we get in this building. That's why we don't only worship online. That's what online doesn't offer us, amongst a lot of other things. But it offers us the ability to sit next to a pew or each other in a pew, put your arm around somebody, look them in the eyes, and tell that they're struggling, and then be that Ruth. Stir them up into love and also good works. I would argue that we need to be more forceful. Don't break down the door, but be more bold, trying to be the Ruth for other people. Look at 2 Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4. Elisha doesn't give nearly the attention that Elijah does. But Elisha, I would argue, is much more practical and pragmatic and everyday than Elijah. Elijah deals with kings and he deals with big shows of religiosity. And I think there's absolutely a place for that and a need for that in that climate. Elisha is more for the everyman. And you see mentions of Elisha that is really dealing with humans. He deals with Naaman and he deals with axe heads and he deals with youths who call him bald. And we're not going to get into that story right now because I'm a little sensitive about that. 2 Kings chapter 4, though, starting in verse 18, this is one of those relationships that Elisha has with different people. In 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 18, the first several verses leading up to this, starting in verse 8, Elisha has one of his friends that he would oftentimes go and stay at their house. And she's a barren woman, she's a widow, she's a barren woman, she doesn't have any children of her own. Elisha recognizes, starting in verse 8, going down to verse 17, that this is something she wants, and so he prophesies that she's going to have a son. And as great as that story is, if that had ended there, that would have been great, but look at verse 18. Woman is born in verse 17. Verse 18, when the child was grown, the day came that he went out to his father, to the reapers, and he said to his father, my head, probably some version of heat stroke, if I were to guess, I'm not a doctor. He said to his servant, carry him to his mother, and when he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her lap until noon, and then he died. And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. And then she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys that I may run to the man of God and return. I want you to notice the emotional impact of this. Because Elisha had promised the Shunammite woman that she would have a son. The best blessing, one of the best blessings, I would argue, this side of eternity. And that son that was given to her providentially through a miraculous pregnancy was given to her, and he was raised, and it seems like that was the only child they had. Very loving relationship, and then he tragically dies while on his mother's lap. And I don't know what you would do in that scenario. I've never been in that situation. I pray I never am. But I know probably what I would probably do is one of the different levels of grief or anger or distress or depression. That's not what the Shunammite woman does. Look in verse 18. Starting in verse 22. She said to her husband and said, please send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys that I may run to the man of God and return. And he said, why will you go to him today? It's neither new moon nor Sabbath. You don't need to go see Elisha now. It's not a religious festival. And she said, it will be well. Don't you worry about why. It's going to be well. Verse 24, then she saddled a donkey and said to her servant, drive and go forward and do not slow down the pace for me unless I tell you. And so she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. She drives those donkeys fast. Second half of 25. When the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi, his servant, behold, there's the Shunammite woman. Please run now and meet her and say to her, is it well with you? Is it well with the husband? It is well with the child. And she answered, it is well. This is now twice. She knows her child is dead. Oh, there goes my microphone. She knows her child is dead. And yet when she's asked by two different people, both by her servants and also by Gehazi, is everything okay? She goes, yeah, it's fine. I don't need to talk to you. That's not where my complaint is. By the way, you can tell from this story that this woman came from the south, because this is exactly how a southern woman would operate. But she's like, I don't have any time for you guys. Verse 28. Verse 27. When she came to the man of God to the hill, she caught hold of his feet, and Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, let her alone, for her soul is troubled within her, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. I don't know why she's here. Verse 28, then she said, did I not ask for a son for my Lord? Did I not say to you, do not deceive me? You promised me a child, and all you gave me was anguish. You promised me a legacy, and all I got was heartbreak. Verse 29, then he said to Gehazi, gird up your loins, take my staff in your hand. Go your way. If you meet any man, don't salute him. If anyone salutes you, don't answer him. Lay my staff on the lad's face. The mother of the lad said, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I'm not going to leave you. You can send me away. You can try sending Gehazi with me. That's not going to be the way the story ends, the Shunammite woman says to Elisha. As the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. And he rose and followed her. Gehazi passed on before them, laid the staff on the lad's face, but there was no sound of response, and so he returned to meet him and told him, the lad hasn't awakened. Elisha came into the house, and behold, the lad was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them both and prayed to the Lord, and he went up and lay on the child and put his mouth in his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, his hands on his hands. He stretched himself on him, and the flesh of that child then became warm. And then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, went up and stretched himself on him. The lad sneezed 7 times, and the lad opened his eyes. Don't ask me about the mechanics of this resurrection. I'm not familiar with that part of it. Verse 36, he called Gehazi, and he said to her, you called the Shunammite. And he called her. When she came into him, he said, take up your son. And then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. That's forcefulness in action. If you're the mother of somebody like this and you lose a child and you feel like the focal point of that anger is the man who promised you that you would have a child, which in this case is Elisha. God told me I would have a child, and yet all I have now is grief. He gave me a kid, just take him away. Then you're going to pass by 2 security checkpoints to get to the one who promised you that child so you can address that complaint to your face. That's boldness in action. That's asking for help when you know you need it. Sometimes we as Christians, we as Texans, we as Americans, we don't ask for help. And on the other side of the coin, we don't give it unless we're 100% confident that we need to give that help. Sometimes we need to. Sometimes we need to detect when people need our assistance, when people need to be helped and they're hanging on by a thread. And we need to offer them that help. Look back at Psalm 27 and verse 13. What's the exact phrase there? I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. There's probably people in your life that are going through something like this right now, where that thread of hope and that thread of faith is so thin, and they're just looking for something to tear it apart before they leave God entirely. And it may be that you or I or somebody can be a Ruth to them, that could carry them through the darkest time of their life as they maintain their faith and hope in God. So I'd ask you this morning, whether you need that hope or not for your own life, and if that's you, we want to be that for you. But I would ask everyone to think about the people in their lives that are really struggling. And really ask yourself, not how you doing, that's not the question, because you know the answer to that. It's not a question of how you holding on, that's not the question. The question that Ruth gave to Naomi was, how can I be of service to you? And then she went and did it. And even when Naomi begged her to leave, Ruth stayed. Who can I be a Ruth to today? Because there's a Naomi out there that probably needs my assistance. And if you're here this morning and you are hanging by a thread, I want to see you down front. I want you talking to the elders. I want you talking to people around you, because I want you to make that faith stronger, to build your hope to where it needs to be, to where you can weather the storms. Do it now as we stand and sing.